probably getting decent sleep for more or less the first time in 10 days because a ceasefire had just been announced in Palestine. And though us organizers and Palestinians in Palestine and in diaspora knew that this would just be a temporary pause in the onslaught of violence, nothing more than a chance to catch our breath between the organizing, the protesting, the doom scrolling, the cars traveling loudly in the streets. For my friends and co-organizers in Gaza, this meant that was the first day they had a chance to sleep without fear that they would wake up to the news that their entire family was gone, something that happened to many this summer. And as we paused to breathe and heal 4 months ago today, we also took action. A group of organizers drafted the letter that we're going to read and deliver today, and it quickly received 1,241 signatures, which includes over 30 Massachusetts advocacy and community organizations. Yeah. Woo. For my entire life, none of my elected officials have had the gall to step a toe out of line outside of the staunch pro-Israel posture that remains essentially ubiquitous across the aisle. But there's a rumble, a low, deep, reverberating sound, and it's coming from the streets, not the halls of Congress. It's evidenced by the thousands of people who marched here in Massachusetts in May, by the 1,200 plus signatures on our letter, by the public outcry in just the last week against the rearrest and torture of 6 escaped Palestinian political prisoners. Just yesterday, there was a protest outside the Israeli embassy in solidarity with the prisoners, leaving spoons outside the embassy gates, a symbol that has, as of late, come to be a signifier of Palestinian steadfastness and freedom. People around the world are raising our voices against apartheid and colonialism in Palestine. And it's working. Representative Presley has moved tremendously in her statements on Palestine and has made an active effort to listen to us Palestinians. Yeah. Senator Markey's faced enormous pressure from his base to take a stance on Palestine. And just last week, it was reported that Representatives AOC, Rashida Tlaib, and Mark Pocan are leading a renewed effort to prohibit the delivery of US-made bombs to Israel, where we all know they will be used on my friends and family. These are baby steps, to be sure, but ones that inspire hope. They're small wins, but we won't stop pressuring our leaders until the US and our government sanctions Israel for its apartheid crimes, or until Palestine is free, whichever one comes first. But while we're talking about the crimes of apartheid, while we're talking about how Israel acts in flagrant disregard of Palestinian human rights, I also want to talk about our fundamental rights that we deserve as Palestinians to live in dignity and freedom. Let's talk about our right to return to our ancestral homes. I want to quote Nora Erekat, an international human rights lawyer and leader in the Palestinian movement, who said, "We have to be careful when we're calling for international law, when we describe what Israel is doing as war crimes." And I'll wait because this is important. Not more important than his motorcycle ride, I'm sure. We have to be careful because Israel's work is also in the battle of changing what the law means. And it's true. Laws are swords in the hands of oppressors and imperialists more often than they are shields of righteous struggle. International law is sadly not a moral compass, but that shouldn't discourage us. It doesn't take a congressional delegation to tell you that the torture of Palestinian political prisoners is immoral. I don't need the UN to tell me it was a war crime for my family to be ethnically cleansed from our villages in 1948. You can listen to people from Gaza tell their own stories about what happened this summer, and you can surmise for yourself if the most moral army in the world would wipe out an entire family 4 generations in one blow. All we need to do is open our eyes to see what's going on around us, learn from each other, and we know where morality resides. This is why I'm so blessed that today we have with us our siblings in struggle, because solidarity through struggle for Palestine is the only way forward. If we want to build people power, we're going to build power collectively. A friend of mine recently analogized systemic oppression to this evil octopus with many tentacles, racism, colonialism, homophobia, transphobia, classism, and ableism being some of the manifestations of injustice. And what that means is that when we nurture a movement for a free Palestine, we must do so alongside movements that address each of these tentacles of oppression. It's because we've got a world to win, a world free of racism, imperialism, and anti-Semitism, a decolonized world, a world where our trans siblings are liberated from patriarchy and violence, a world that heartily abolishes cages of deportations, rejects surveillance, and strives to create something better. A world where we don't have to collect over 1,000 signatures and march right up to the offices of our elected officials just to convey that our people deserve dignity and freedom, and we're going to win that world together. Thanks, y'all. And so this leads me to introduce our next speaker, who's a friend of mine and a personal hero, Fatima Ahmed, the Executive Director of the Muslim Justice League. Fatima has been with MJL since 2017, when she increased MJL's focus on organizing within and collaborating across impacted communities to resist and subvert surveillance. Fatima has led the fight to end countering violent extremism, otherwise known as CVE, which is a pernicious form of Islamophobic surveillance that was piloted here in Boston. And at the helm of the Muslim Justice League, she's been shedding light on the misuse of police money and resisting other racist policing and surveillance programs by building power with Muslim, Black and Brown, and youth communities in Boston. Thank you so much for being here, Fatima.
Hello, and thank you, Leah, for such a kind introduction. I am Fatima Ahmed. I am Executive Director of Muslim Justice League, a local organization led by Muslim women fighting for justice for everyone. We happen to be here today 20 years after George Bush announced the so-called war on terror. It's a grave milestone. It's a grave anniversary to think about, and we have to actually acknowledge this today as we talk about Palestine. Because first of all, if you think that the war started 20 years ago, then you haven't dug deep enough. Then we're not talking about the same thing. And when we're talking about Palestine today, we have to understand not just what happened this summer and not just what happened this year, but what has happened over decades, right? Between Palestine and the global war on terror, we have to acknowledge what is the U.S. role in violence globally. I know that a lot of you protested this summer for Palestine, and I know that a lot of you, this same group, protested last summer for Black lives. And yet here we are still asking our elected officials to listen and step up. I appreciate that Leah is giving you all, some generosity that I will not give you today. Because we're pretty tired of protesting again and again and hearing our elected officials make shallow promises while you continue to sign off on every budget that gives funding to Israel and that gives funding to local law enforcement as you watch them brutalize our communities. You shouldn't need thousands of people protesting every summer to know that. You shouldn't need people tweeting today about closing Guantanamo and ending the 1033 amendment that allows the Department of Defense to give equipment and weapons to local law enforcement to do the right thing. We know that Massachusetts has been a place historically of resistance. And when we talk about that, we're talking about from the ground up. We're talking about local abolitionists who wanted to end slavery, right? And we're talking about that history continuing today with local abolitionists wanting to defund law enforcement and wanting to end our complicity in the violence in Palestine. And yet we watch our elected officials time and time again make excuses and avoid taking more than just baby steps. 20 years after the war on terror was announced, my question to you is, what are you going to do now? Are you going to ban local law enforcement from training in Israel with the Israel Defense Forces? Are you going to end the 1033 program today and stop giving local law enforcement militarized equipment and weapons? Are you going to co-sign the demands of the community that you're getting today? Or will you continue to let the status quo happen as people are brutalized day by day? Because what we know from last summer and this summer is that that one moment is not enough. Us coming together and protesting one day does not reflect the violence that people face every single day. I know this. I live in Boston. I live in a Black and brown community. I watch law enforcement, the way that they treat me and the way that they treat my neighbors. And I know, because I'm Egyptian and Muslim, how my family is treated abroad and how my people are treated abroad. And I've been to Palestine and I've been harassed. And I know so many people here today know how that feels and are using every tactic possible, the protests and the letters and the petitions and the social media. And so I'm not here to ask our people, what more are you going to do? I'm here to ask Senators Markey and Warren and our representatives and every local city council and mayor, what are you going to do? Thank you.
Got some hand sanitizer in my eyes. Okay, let's hear it again for Fatima, because that was the energy we need today. And y'all from the senator's office, I hope you were taking notes. So unfortunately, a colleague of ours, Trey Andre Valentine, the executive director of the Massachusetts Trans Political Coalition, couldn't be here today. But I do just want to say thank you to Trey Andre for offering to be here, and we're sorry you couldn't make it. I also want to talk about the fact that there's a reason that we're outside the JFK Federal Building. Put down the hand sanitizer. COVID times, y'all. And the reason that we're outside the JFK Federal Building is because the people who work here, some of whom have joined us today, have a lot of power. And right now, the US bankrolls Israeli apartheid. And the people in this building and in front of us here have the power to help stop that. And as their constituents and supporters, we need them to use that power. And that brings me to our next speaker, Grace Abe, one of the people who has been pressuring our electeds to do just that. Grace is a junior at Tufts University studying biology and environmental studies. Yeah, Grace! She is involved in student activism at Tufts, including the fossil fuel divestment movement and the Sunrise Movement. She formerly volunteered for Senators Warren and Markey and is speaking today on behalf of her friend and fellow Tufts student, Amanda, who also volunteered for those campaigns. Thank you for being here, Grace.
Hi, my name is Grace. I volunteered with Amanda for Senator Warren on her presidential campaign and for Senator Markey on his re-election campaign. Amanda unfortunately could not be here today, so I will read the statement on her behalf. Hi, my name is Amanda, and I've been a huge supporter of both Senator Warren and Senator Markey in the past. I interned for Senator Warren 3 different times, supporting her on her re-election and presidential campaigns, and worked for Senator Markey as first a volunteer fellow and then a full-time field organizer and member of his re-election campaign staff. I worked for both candidates because I believed in their messages and because they've claimed to stand for progress, justice, and equality. I believed in their visions for the future and felt hopeful and inspired that electing them would make a difference for marginalized people and help challenge the imperialism, racism, and capitalism that dominate the world we live in. They both made the case during their re-election campaigns that with them in the Senate representing the people of Massachusetts, they would use their power to stand up for justice. And so I supported them, and on both campaigns, worked for dozens and dozens of hours to recruit fellow young people and students to work for them as well, often without pay or compensation. Unfortunately, though, that hasn't been the case. Neither Senator Warren nor Senator Markey has stood up for Palestine in the face of the ongoing occupation and terrible actions against them by the Israeli government. Their voices on this issue as United States senators are more crucial now than ever. I'm confused how they could claim to be progressive during their re-election campaigns, and then now, when they're most needed, turn their backs on the Palestinian people. In the Senate, they would have the power to end U.S. financial and ideological support for Israel that enables these injustices, but are actively choosing not to. And why? Because of fear and political convenience. The violence and injustices that Palestinians face are a human rights crisis. Palestinians are being forced out of their homes, their land being occupied, and their rights being taken away right now. Now is not the time for any of us to be silent. Now is the time to speak up and unequivocally condemn these human rights abuses. Senator Warren and Senator Markey, I'm standing here with your constituents as a past supporter of you both and asking you to support Palestine and follow through on what you promised to do during your campaign. It's not enough to make statements that say nothing and abuse both sides. Instead, I hope you find the political courage to do what is right and what is needed. We're delivering this letter today because as your constituents, we believe you must support Palestine and that it is the only moral position to take. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Grace. Let's hear it again for Grace. In retrospect, there's a lot of traffic that happens in this area. We'll think about that next time. So today we're really honored to have with us a comrade Jude, who is from the Alliance for Water Justice in Palestine, and who's here to deliver a message on behalf of our comrades who are protesting Line 3. Let's hear it for Jude.
Hi, everyone. This is just a message of love and solidarity from our beloved water protectors in Anishinaabe land, which is in so-called northern Minnesota, who have been fighting tirelessly to stop to honor treaty rights and to protect their sovereignty over their land and water. And I had the great honor to go out there. We had raised $1,000 to give in solidarity, and when they heard it was from the Palestine Solidarity community, they were very moved and sent back their own love and solidarity in this international global struggle.
What is Line 3?
Line 3 is one of the many pipelines that Enbridge has been, which is a Canadian corporation that is violating all sorts of regulations and laws to bring this very toxic type of oil down through the, I'm not sure if it's the Bakken land. Not quite sure which. It's the tar sands. Right, the Bakken is with North Dakota. And they've been fighting for many years now. It's going through Michigan. And Line 3 is the line that's going through the headwaters of the Mississippi River. And unlike Standing Rock, it's crossing many rivers and it's already leaking the drilling fluids, and the Enbridge is notorious for leaks. So on many, many levels, it is a gross violation, and we're trying to put as much pressure as we can. It doesn't have the same visibility and public outcry that the XL and the DAPL struggle has, but recently the squad was out there, and we're hoping Warren and Markey will also take a strong position in the struggle for sovereignty.
Just one more thing, it's going through their wild rice beds, which is like medicine for them and also economy for them.
Right.
So
It's like the olive trees.
Shore. Exactly.
It's the olive trees for the Anishinaabe people.
Thank you, Jude, and we're so blessed to have a message. We're so blessed to have a message from the water defenders in Line 3, and protesting Line 3. And as a Palestinian standing here, it can never escape our notice that we stand currently on colonized land, colonized Massachusetts and Wampanoag land. And so when we talk about the struggles that the Anishinaabe people are facing, we also must recognize that there's ongoing colonization happening right here. And with that, I'd like to turn, I think that's well in spirit of the letter that we're delivering today. And I'd like to introduce my comrade, Devin Apollo, who's an assistant professor of psychology at a local university and an organizer here in the Palestinian community. He's an expert in decolonial clinical community psychology practice, trauma and resistance, and healing justice, racism and racialization, resistance to settler colonialism, and interlocking systems of oppression. Devin uses community-based, participatory, and action-oriented approaches to research. He's also a comrade of mine, a big brother in struggle, and someone I've personally leaned on and learned from a lot these past few months when I really needed it. He was one of the authors and visionaries of this letter, and I'm thrilled that he'll be reading it for us today. Let's give it up for Devin.
Thank you all for being here. I'm just going to pick it up. Can you hear me all right? Oh, that's loud. So thank you for being here. I wanted to begin by sharing that before I read the letter, I wanted to just share that, I understand, I think we all understand that the landscape of hate can be hard to see when you're in a position of power, right? Especially when you're in a position of state power. We know, as Palestinians, that our state representatives here in Massachusetts do not see us often as fully human when they act. They do not see us as fully humans and instead continue to racial us as Arab other or as Palestinian other when supporting the Israeli apartheid. And honestly, it feels dehumanizing for us to even come here to ask for change. Because we're not begging. We're not begging to be seen as fully human. With our histories and with our dreams for decolonial futures. Our state representatives need to change for their own humanity. Let's be clear about that. The politics need to change in ways that create conditions for our Palestinian peoples to be free, because we know that the conditions of our freedom as Palestinian people will not magically appear. We know that the barriers to our freedom are rooted in white supremacy and cultures of hate and coloniality. Barriers to our freedom that 6 Palestinian prisoners dug past. Even though recaptured by the Israeli state, yes, but these 6 Palestinian fugitives rehumanized us all. Their courageous transgressions were met, of course, with brutal repression. Bones of elders were broken, right? We know this. That family members, community members of those who escaped were targeted in collective punishment. If our U.S. representatives support these actions of Israel, they support blatant human rights abuses of the most brutal kind. And we know that the conditions of our freedom, as I said, will not magically appear. We must be part of the steady work of eliminating the reliance on hate and the reliance on colonialism in our institutions. We need to make the walls, the prisons, the militarized police and soldiers become obsolete by the steady work of our spoons. We know that the conditions of our freedom must be dug out. And this steady work is what brought us here today, right? It's a weekday on a Monday, and we're here in the middle of the day. This is our steady work. Our freedom is not fugitive. The bodies of so many of our people are in prison. But like the 6 Palestinians who dug out beyond the wall have reminded us, our freedom can never be exiled. We are not leaving, as my shirt says. This was created by a youth group of Palestine. The conditions of our freedom will be dug out, down deep, and we're ready with our spoons and our shovels. With our loving communities, our allies, our decolonial attitudes, justice can't wait, and neither can we. We're ready to end U.S. complicity in Israeli apartheid. Who's with us? Right. So in that spirit, and honored to be even speaking of the prisoners, I want to read the letter that we all co-wrote from the Palestinian organizing collective here in Boston with our allies. And we don't represent all Palestinians in Boston, of course. We're a group of activists, of families that come together in shared struggle. So here's the letter. Dear elected officials of our Commonwealth of Massachusetts, we Palestinian American constituents and allies urge you as concerned residents of the Commonwealth to end our complicity in Israel's apartheid system of military occupation, settler colonization, and disregard for the humanity of the Palestinian people. Our government sends $3.8 billion in military funding to Israel per year in violation of multiple U.S. laws. U.S. financial and political support enables Israel's apartheid and settler colonialism. For decades, Palestinian land has been systematically seized through procedures that Israeli officials openly refer to as Judaizing, which is the process of trying to make mixed or Palestinian neighborhoods entirely Jewish. Israel systematically denies Palestinian permits to build on their own land, demolishes Palestinian homes, and gives the land to Jewish Israeli settlers to build homes on occupied Palestinian lands, in violation of international law. Palestinians must cross Israeli checkpoints to get to work, to school, within their own territory, while Israeli Jewish settlers bypass checkpoints via Jewish-only roads. The 2018 national state law enshrines Jewish settlement as a national value to expand the government's occupation of Palestinian territories and aims to place Jewish collective rights above individual rights and freedoms. Already 10% of the West Bank already 10% of the Israeli population, about 650 to 700,000 settlers live on Palestinian land and occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. That's why both B'Tselem, the Israeli Human Rights Organization, and Human Rights Watch have recently joined the world in calling Israeli systemic oppression of Palestine by its proper name, apartheid. With that in mind, we urge you to avoid framing Israeli colonization of Palestine as a conflict with two sides, because it normalizes the reality of Israel's ongoing seizure and control of Palestinian land and lives. Israeli leaders frequently refer to the periodic bombings of Gaza as mowing the lawn, dehumanizing Palestinians as weeds. Israel's May 2021 attack of Gaza killed 256 Palestinians, left 40,000 homeless, and destroyed the only COVID testing site. Gaza is one of the most densely populated areas in the world, and as a result, bombardment inevitably causes civilian deaths. In this aggression, several entire families were killed by airstrikes on civilian homes. Furthermore, Israel's 13-year siege of Gaza has choked the economy, resulting in critical shortages of food, fuel, and essential medicines, making over 90% of Gaza's water unfit for human consumption. Israel's oppression of Palestinians is made possible by our government's political support and billions of tax dollars. The U.S. can securely call itself the strongest ally in the apartheid regime. It is particularly disturbing that at this time, when Palestinian families are rebuilding their homes from rubble and mourning their lost parents, siblings, and children, the U.S. officials are considering adding $1 billion in military funding to Israel. It is in blatant disregard of Palestinian life to reward the brutality of the Israeli military with surplus funds, as it kills Palestinian civilians with impunity. Instead, we should be devoting taxpayer dollars to rebuilding other communities of color at home and abroad. We understand our Palestinian struggle for liberation as part of an international struggle for black liberation, indigenous liberation, and liberation for all oppressed peoples. Colonialism has created systems of oppression in the Americas and around the world, including Palestine. European settlers waged colonial violence here against indigenous groups in the Commonwealth, such as the Massachusetts, Fatima, Nipmuc, Pentucket, Pawtucket, and Pentecost peoples. Similar racist dehumanization and systemic systems of oppression with forced segregation and apartheid-like violences were enforced by European settlers and white Americans against black and African American peoples in the Commonwealth and Massachusetts as well. As a Commonwealth and a nation, we must push for racial equity and rehumanization of indigenous and oppressed peoples, and end our role in perpetuating colonial violence in the U.S. and around the world. So rejecting apartheid in Israel and Palestine is an essential part of dismantling systemic oppression everywhere. And in that spirit, I pass it back to Leah. So 3 points that are action steps that we demand our representatives to take. Thank you.
Let's hear it again for Devin. Those were beautiful words, the letter and what he said before. I want to re-emphasize that his shirt says Len Rahel, which means we will not leave.
No, we won't.
Hell yeah. Hell yeah. All right, now I'm going to read the demands of the letter. That's what you came here for, right? 1, end all U.S. military funding to Israel and support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Demand application of pre-existing U.S. arms export regulations to stop the deployment of U.S. weapons against civilians in Palestine. And I want to talk a little bit about what all of you who don't work for the senators can do to support that aim, which is you can support BDS groups locally by following BDS Boston on social media and signing the international petition that we are supporting right now to get Puma to drop their sponsorship of the Israeli Football Association. Our second demand. Support and introduce a Senate version of H.R. 2590 defending the human rights of Palestinian children and families living under Israeli Military Occupation Act. 2590. And for those of you who don't work in the senator's office, you can see JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace Boston members who are here among the crowd today, who have flyers and information about that bill and what you can do to support it. Our third demand. We demand a serious congressional investigation into the role of U.S. arms funding the violent Israeli repression and displacement of Palestinians in occupied Jerusalem and the West Bank, working along with the long-standing siege and bombing of Gaza. We don't need a congressional delegation to tell us this is wrong, but we know it will go a long way to getting our Congress to sanction Israel. And if you want to help out with that goal, you can call your senators and your representatives. Let them know that you want them to demand a congressional investigation and to sanction Israel. Because the time has come to end U.S. sponsorship of apartheid, occupation, and dispossession in Palestine. And with that, I'd like to hand off the letter that we wrote along with all of the signatories to representatives from Senator Markey and Senator Warren's office, if you wouldn't mind coming forward. Now you have the letter, so you can count the signatures. All right, I won't keep y'all here for too long, but I just wanted to say I opened about talking about some of the small steps that have given us hope for a liberated Palestine. But I want to be abundantly clear about something. We're not satisfied with small steps. We're not standing here and talking to you all for fun. We're here because we wrote and signed this letter, and we want you to listen to us. Meet our demands. Support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Sanction Israel. Because doing anything less than that is asking Palestinians to die quietly. And that, I promise you, we will never do. We will free ourselves, and so the question remains, whose side are you on? Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here today.